Good evening, Mayor and Council. You just have me tonight. Okay, so I wanted to do a very quick update and presentation on the new law that was just passed. There's been quite a bit of miscommunication, misinformation in the community. So I just wanted to provide kind of a higher level overview of the new legislation just for council's purpose and for the public. So, and I don't want to get too far into the details because there's still a lot that is unknown and kind of still being worked out, but we do know some things. So this new legislation was just passed about a month ago on March 31st. The new legislation was the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, which actually puts into effect Chapter 7A, which is called the Cannabis Law. It is effective immediately. So the purpose of it is to create this regulated cannabis industry, but also to provide some social and economic justice relating to the sale and use. What do we mean when we say immediate? So there's two different categories. There's possession and use and sales. With respect to possession and use, it is immediately legal. So for ages 21 and older, possession and use up to 3 ounces of cannabis or 24 grams concentrated. However, sales are not expected until late into 2022. So I know this is one of the kind of points of confusion in the community. The reason for that is that in order to sell, you need a license from New York State. So those licenses relate to operating cooperatives, micro businesses, nurseries, on-site consumption, engaging in cultivating, processing, distributing, delivering, or dispensing. So there's a whole laundry list of categories that require licensing from the state. So again, one of the reasons for this update and clarification is just to point out there's a distinction between what has to happen on the state level and what has to happen on the local level. So the licensing is done through New York State. There's 2 agencies. The Cannabis Control Board, they actually consist of appointees selected by the governor and the legislature, and they are responsible for issuing and revoking licenses to growers and distributors. They establish standards for the product. And then the Office of Cannabis Management actually oversees cultivation and sales. They are actually controlled by the board. With respect to local governments, prior to any applications for licensing, applicants would need to notify their local government, so they would need to notify the city to give the city an opportunity to comment on those proposed licensing. It's kind of similar with respect to alcohol. So businesses that sell alcohol have to go through a similar process of notifying the municipality for that license. So, but the city and local governments are preempted from adopting any sort of rules or laws relating to licensing. We are not allowed to do that. What can we do? So this is we're going to talk about both of these choices. There's basically two layers for local governments. There's a choice of opting out, which we're going to talk about in more detail, and then there's a choice of not opting out but regulating the time, place, and manner of sales. So opting out, how does it work? It's not an opt-in, it's an opt-out. And what it is a local law that a municipality can pass to prohibit specifically dispensary retail sales or on-site consumption. So all of the other categories that are legalized under this law would not apply. The opt-out is very specific to just those 2 categories. And it is subject to a permissive referendum. The deadline to opt out is this December 31st. Municipalities, local governments, so cities, towns, and villages cannot opt out after the deadline, cannot. They can opt in at any time. But when I say opt in, I mean opt in after you've opted out. So there's no actual opt in at the beginning. Does that make sense? You know, it gets a little confusing. The permissive referendum can get lost in this. What it is essentially, if a municipality decides that it wants to pass a local law opting out, that local law does not take effect until two things happen. 45 days have to pass after the vote, and then it would have to be approved by a public vote or a question on the next ballot of an election if a petition is filed requiring that question or proposal be put onto the ballot. So I know that this gets a little messy. Petitions have to be filed within 45 days of the vote, and the question has to be placed on the ballot more than 60 days after the petition is filed. So if you're not confused yet, the timeline, what I did was I backed it out, and actually with the help of NICOM on this, they had said in a recent seminar, they said, listen, if a municipality wanted to opt out and wanted this question put onto the November 2nd Election Day ballot, this is what the timeline would look like. The local law for our purposes would need to be passed in June. Deadlines for filing any petition would be August 2nd, and then you would get to November. So it's a bit of some time. Revenue-wise, there is a 13% excise tax on the sales. Of that 13%, 9% goes to New York State, 3% would go to the city or the local municipality, and 1% goes to the county. If the city opts out or if the local municipality opts out, there is no tax revenue received at all. And that cannot be recaptured. So if a local municipality decided to opt out and then later decides to opt back in, you can't go back and recapture those funds. They're lost. Yes, this is on top of sales tax. This is its own tax, and there are no restrictions on how the funds are to be used. So that's the opt-out. The other option or choice is regulating the time, place, and manner. So if the city decided to proceed ahead with regulation of dispensaries and on-site consumption, which again, those are the only two categories that are involved, it would come down to looking at local zoning, which we already have a chapter for that, which could be amended or modified. This is not something that's expressly addressed in the new legislation. So again, it's one of those things that still has to be worked through. The one thing that is said is that regulations like these cannot be unreasonably impracticable. One of those legal terms that, again, gets fleshed out as you go. But factors would include, the types of businesses in a permitted location or area, pedestrian, vehicular traffic, noise, impact, that sort of thing, which always comes into play when we're talking about zoning. There are already in place regulations with respect to smoking, so smoking cigarettes and tobacco and vaping. Those apply to marijuana, cannabis, but there are also additional smoking prohibitions with respect to cannabis that are set forth in the new legislation, and there's some new additional criminal penalties for smoking near schools, libraries, that sort of those locations. The city already has in place a smoking policy, and actually the definition is broad enough that it actually includes smoking of any substance, including any sort of weed or plant inside or near city facilities, as well as within 50 feet of our parks and playgrounds. Our employer labor concerns, I threw in this slide. This is something that's ongoing. Again, the city has just begun discussions with our unions on this, and it is clear from the legislation that employers cannot discriminate against employees for using cannabis. However, employers are not barred from discipline or discharge if an employee is impaired while on the job, or there's some other state or federal regulation that comes into play. So there's more on that we have to flesh out, but I just wanted to make a note of that.